The worst storms are never the ones outside. They are the ones that quietly convince you there is nowhere left to go. I believed I was driving toward the end of my marriage. I never imagined I was driving toward the beginning of the rest of my life. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up as heavy rain pounded against the glass with relentless force. Every few seconds lightning flashed across the dark Oregon sky, briefly revealing towering pine trees bending beneath powerful winds before everything disappeared into darkness again. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the highway curved deeper into the mountains. Less than 6 hours earlier I had walked out of my attorney's office carrying a folder labeled divorce settlement. 30 years of marriage had somehow been reduced to signatures, financial statements, and carefully organized legal documents. I kept replaying my husband's final words in my mind. They had not been angry. They had been worse. They had been indifferent. Somewhere along the way we had stopped seeing each other. I had spent years believing love could survive silence if I simply worked harder. Instead, the silence had quietly become our entire relationship. My plan had been simple. Drive to the small mountain lodge where I had reserved a cabin for the weekend, turn off my phone, and allow myself the space to breathe for the first time in months. The storm had other plans. A bright orange barricade suddenly appeared across the narrow road ahead. I pressed the brakes carefully, stopping beside a county emergency truck where a park ranger stepped into the rain wearing a reflective jacket already soaked by the weather. He leaned toward my window after I lowered it a few inches. "The road ahead is closed," he said over the roar of the wind. "A landslide blocked the pass about 2 miles from here. Nobody is getting through tonight." My heart sank. "Is there another route?" He slowly shook his head. "Not until tomorrow afternoon if the weather improves." I looked at the map on my dashboard before quietly asking the only question that mattered. "Is there anywhere nearby to stay?" He thought for a moment before pointing toward a narrow gravel road disappearing between the trees. "About 3 miles that way there is an old Forest Service cabin rented by a local family. It is usually reserved months in advance, but if anyone canceled because of the storm, it is your best chance." 20 minutes later my tires rolled slowly through deep puddles before stopping outside a weathered cedar cabin standing alone beside a quiet lake hidden beneath sheets of rain. Warm light glowed through the front windows, offering the first comforting sight I had seen all day. I climbed the porch steps carrying my overnight bag, grateful simply to be somewhere dry. Before I could knock, the front door opened from the inside. A woman about my age stood there holding a lantern even though the lights behind her were still glowing. She had shoulder-length chestnut hair, calm blue eyes, and the kind of quiet expression that made people feel safe before a single word was spoken. She looked almost as surprised to see me as I was to see her. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. I explained the road closure, the storm, and the ranger's directions. She listened carefully before offering an apologetic smile. "I am afraid I already rented this cabin for the weekend." My heart dropped. At that exact moment every light inside the cabin suddenly flickered twice before the power went out completely. Darkness surrounded us except for the soft glow of the lantern between us while thunder echoed across the lake. We both turned instinctively toward the empty parking area as another vehicle failed to appear through the rain. There would be no one else coming. She looked back at me, then quietly stepped aside from the doorway. "You should probably come inside until we figure this out." I crossed the threshold, unaware that one small decision made during the worst storm of my life was about to change everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and finding home in the last place I ever expected. The warmth inside the cabin felt almost unreal after the icy rain outside. The woman carefully placed the lantern on a sturdy wooden table, before adding another log to the stone fireplace. Flames quickly grew brighter, filling the room with soft orange light that danced across the pine walls. I finally noticed the cabin itself. It was simple but beautiful, with handmade quilts folded across a wide wooden bed, shelves lined with well-loved books, and large windows overlooking a lake now hidden behind sheets of rain. My eyes stopped on the bed. There was only one. The woman followed my glance and gave a quiet, slightly embarrassed smile. "I suppose that explains why the owner called it a couple's cabin." I laughed softly for the first time all day. Life certainly has an unusual sense of humor. She introduced herself as Evelyn Carter. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who never rushed to fill silence simply because silence existed. I told her my name was Claire Bennett, We shook hands, both of us still damp from the storm, and somehow the simple introduction made the strange situation feel less unsettling. A loud clap of thunder shook the windows, followed by another brief flicker from the emergency battery lights before they faded completely. Only the fire and lantern remained. Evelyn reached for an old battery-powered radio resting on the shelf and carefully adjusted the dial until a weather report came through the static. The announcer warned that the storm had intensified across the mountain region. Fallen trees and flooding had blocked multiple roads, and emergency crews expected travel conditions to remain dangerous until at least the following afternoon. We exchanged the same silent realization. Neither of us would be leaving anytime soon. Evelyn quietly opened a pantry filled with neatly organized supplies. "The owner always keeps emergency food here," she said. "Soup, pasta, canned vegetables, coffee, and enough firewood for several days." She looked toward me with an apologetic smile. "I cannot promise anything fancy, but I can make a decent bowl of tomato soup." "After today," I answered. "That sounds perfect." We worked together without discussing it. I sliced bread while she warmed soup on a small propane burner stored for power outages. The ordinary rhythm of preparing dinner with someone I had met less than an hour earlier felt strangely comforting. Outside, the wind howled across the lake. Inside, the cabin smelled of toasted bread, tomatoes, basil, and burning cedar. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, listening to rain strike the roof while steam curled gently from our mugs. Conversation came naturally. Evelyn was a landscape photographer who spent months traveling across the Pacific Northwest documenting forests, lakes, and forgotten mountain towns before they slowly disappeared beneath modern development. I admitted that I worked as an interior designer, creating homes that always seemed more peaceful than my own had become. Neither of us immediately mentioned failed relationships. Instead, we spoke about favorite places, books we returned to every year, and why quiet mornings always felt more honest than busy afternoons. Time moved differently inside the cabin. There were no notifications, no traffic, and no schedules demanding attention. Only rain, firelight, and two strangers discovering that conversation could still feel effortless. Eventually, Evelyn stood and carried our empty bowls toward the sink. "There is something I should probably mention now instead of later," she said with a nervous laugh. She pointed toward the bedroom. "There really is only one bed. I can sleep in the rocking chair if necessary." I looked at the oversized chair before smiling gently. "Neither of us is sleeping there. We are adults. We can figure this out respectfully." Relief softened her expression almost immediately. She nodded once, grateful that the awkward question had found such a simple answer. Outside, the storm continued without mercy, but inside the little cabin, the distance between two strangers had already become just a little smaller than either of us expected. The fire burned lower as the evening settled deeper around the cabin, and the storm showed no sign of surrendering. Rain struck the roof in steady waves while the wind wrapped itself around the old cedar walls with a sound that felt almost alive. Evelyn found several thick blankets folded inside a wooden chest near the fireplace and spread one across the rug before sitting cross-legged with a steaming mug of chamomile tea. She looked toward me with an easy smile. "I have discovered that storms become much less frightening when there is good tea involved." I laughed softly and joined her on the rug, grateful for the warmth rising from the fire. We talked about ordinary things at first. Favorite seasons, childhood vacations, the best pie either of us had ever tasted. Somewhere between those simple conversations, the careful distance we had both maintained began to disappear without either of us noticing. The cabin no longer felt like a place where two strangers had been forced together. It felt like a quiet pause from two lives that had become far too complicated. The wind suddenly howled through the trees, followed by a loud crack somewhere outside. We both looked toward the window. A large pine branch had fallen across the front path, completely blocking the only route to the road. Evelyn quietly stood, lifted the lantern, and checked the front door before returning with a calm expression. "We are definitely staying here until morning." Instead of feeling trapped, I found myself strangely relieved. There was nowhere else I needed to be. Nowhere else I wanted to pretend everything was fine. Evelyn disappeared briefly into the small hallway before returning with a worn cardboard box filled with board games, playing cards, and old journals left behind by previous visitors. One notebook caught my attention. Every guest had written a few pages before leaving. Some entries described fishing trips or family vacations. Others spoke about marriage proposals, anniversaries, and children roasting marshmallows beside the lake. One sentence, written several years earlier, quietly stayed with me. Sometimes the place that shelters you from the storm also shelters your heart. I closed the journal without saying anything. Evelyn must have noticed my expression because she asked softly, "Did someone write something meaningful?" I nodded. More meaningful than they probably realized. She smiled knowingly but never asked me to read it aloud. The silence between us had become comfortable enough that explanations no longer felt necessary. Later we decided to make hot chocolate using powdered cocoa tucked away in the pantry. As we searched the cabinets together, our hands reached for the same ceramic mug at exactly the same moment. We both stopped and laughed. "You take it," I said. She gently shook her head. "Ladies first. We are both ladies." Her smile widened. "Then we have discovered our first impossible decision." The laughter lingered longer than the joke deserved, but neither of us seemed interested in ending it. We carried our mugs to the large picture window overlooking the lake. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the water before darkness returned once more. The reflection of the fire danced softly across the glass beside our own reflections. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said after several quiet minutes. "Of course." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "When you drove into this storm, what were you really trying to escape?" I stared into my mug while the warmth rose gently around my hands. For months I had answered every question with carefully rehearsed sentences that revealed almost nothing. Somehow those answers no longer seemed necessary. "I spent so many years trying to save a marriage," I whispered, "that I forgot there was still a person inside me worth saving." The words hung quietly in the room. Evelyn did not rush to comfort me or offer advice. She simply reached across the small space between us and rested her hand lightly over mine for a single steady moment. There was nothing romantic about the gesture, yet everything inside me softened. It was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had offered comfort without expecting anything in return. As another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, I realized I was no longer counting the hours until the storm ended. Instead, I found myself hoping the morning would not arrive quite as quickly as it usually did. The cabin grew quieter as midnight settled over the mountains, yet the storm outside seemed determined to stay awake until dawn. Rain still swept across the roof in steady waves while the fireplace filled the room with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of cedar. Evelyn glanced toward the bedroom before looking back at me with an almost apologetic smile. "We should probably get some sleep," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be easier if the roads reopen." I nodded, though neither of us moved right away. The reality we had joked about earlier now stood waiting for us. One cabin, one bed. Nothing about the situation felt romantic. It simply required trust between two people who had begun the evening as strangers and somehow ended it as companions. Evelyn quietly unfolded every extra blanket she could find and arranged them carefully across the mattress, creating a clear line down the center with folded quilts. She laughed at her own effort. "I think this might be the most respectful bed in Oregon." I smiled. "It certainly looks that way." We turned off the lantern, leaving only the fire casting soft light through the room. The bed was wide enough that we could lie comfortably without touching. Even so, I remained on the far edge while she rested on the opposite side. The quiet stretched between us, but it no longer felt awkward. Outside, another burst of thunder rolled across the lake. Inside, the steady crackle of burning wood slowly settled my racing thoughts. "Are you awake?" Evelyn asked after several minutes. "Yes." She hesitated before speaking again. "Can I tell you something I have never told anyone I met on the first day?" I turned slightly toward her, though the darkness hid most of her expression. "I would like that." She released a slow breath. 5 years ago I was engaged. We had planned an autumn wedding beside the ocean. 3 weeks before the ceremony, she told me she no longer recognized herself inside the life we were building together. She left with kindness, but she still left. Her voice remained calm, yet I could hear the quiet ache beneath every word. Since then I have spent more time traveling than staying anywhere long enough to feel attached. I listened without interrupting. There was something deeply comforting about the honesty filling the room. It did not ask for sympathy, simply existed. After a long silence, I finally whispered, "My marriage ended differently, but loneliness sounds remarkably similar no matter how it begins." Evelyn gave a quiet laugh. "Perhaps loneliness speaks the same language everywhere." The words lingered in the darkness long after she stopped talking. I found myself sharing things I had not intended to tell anyone. I admitted how often I had hidden my disappointment behind polite smiles. I admitted that I no longer remembered the last time someone had asked how I was feeling, and genuinely waited for the answer. She never interrupted. She never tried to solve anything. She simply listened with complete attention. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, exhaustion finally caught up with us. The storm softened into gentle rain while the fire settled into glowing embers. I closed my eyes, surprised by how safe I felt in a place that had been completely unfamiliar only hours earlier. Sometime before sunrise, I woke briefly when another distant rumble echoed through the mountains. Without realizing it, both of us had drifted slightly toward the center of the bed during the night. There was still respectful space between us, yet the invisible distance that had existed at the beginning of the evening had quietly disappeared. As I lay there listening to the rain fade into silence, I realized something had already changed inside me. For the first time since my marriage had fallen apart, I was no longer imagining how to survive tomorrow. I was beginning to wonder what it might feel like to genuinely look forward to it. Morning arrived with a silence so complete that it almost felt unfamiliar. I opened my eyes to pale sunlight filtering through the curtains instead of thunder rolling across the mountains. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot where I was. Then I noticed the gentle warmth of the fireplace, the scent of fresh pine drifting through the slightly open window, and Evelyn already standing outside on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She looked toward the lake as though she had been greeting the morning long before I had awakened. I quietly slipped out of bed, grateful that we had somehow shared an entire night in the same room with nothing except trust growing between us. The storm had washed the world clean. Water sparkled from every branch, birds returned to the trees, and sunlight danced across the calm surface of the lake. Evelyn turned as I stepped onto the porch. "Good morning," she said with the same gentle smile that already felt strangely familiar. She handed me a second mug. "I thought you might appreciate coffee before reality catches up with us." I accepted it with a quiet laugh. Reality has never arrived carrying coffee before. We stood together watching thin ribbons of mist slowly disappear from the water. Everything felt lighter than it had the evening before. The fear that had followed me into the mountains seemed farther away, replaced by something I had almost forgotten how to recognize: peace. After breakfast, we decided to clear the fallen pine branch blocking the front path. Working side by side, we dragged smaller limbs away from the trail and stacked them neatly beside the cabin. It was simple work, but every shared effort made conversation easier. We laughed when neither of us could lift the largest section alone, and eventually solved the problem by rolling it together instead of trying to carry it. "That seems to describe life," Evelyn said with a smile. "The heaviest things usually move only after someone helps." I looked at her for a long moment without answering because I knew she was talking about far more than a tree. Once the path was clear, we walked toward the small dock extending into the lake. Sunlight reflected across the water in brilliant shades of blue while dragonflies skimmed the surface with effortless grace. Evelyn reached into her camera bag for the first time since we met. "May I take one photograph?" she asked softly. "Only if you truly want to." I hesitated before nodding. "Just one." She did not tell me how to stand or where to look. Instead, she simply waited. We talked about favorite childhood memories, and somewhere in the middle of remembering summers spent beside my grandparents' garden, I laughed without thinking. The camera clicked once. Evelyn lowered it immediately. "That was the moment," she whispered. Curious, I stepped beside her to look at the image. The woman smiling back at me looked relaxed, hopeful, and unexpectedly alive. I barely recognized her. "You captured someone I have not seen in years," I admitted quietly. Evelyn looked at the photograph before meeting my eyes. "No," she said gently. "She has been there all along. She simply forgot someone was allowed to see her." My heart tightened with emotion I could not yet name. Before I could answer, a vibration echoed from the phone inside my jacket pocket. I glanced at the screen. A message from my attorney had arrived. The subject line was painfully short.
Urgent.
New information regarding your divorce settlement. I opened the email slowly. Attached beneath the message was a photograph of a diamond engagement ring resting inside a velvet box. The caption below it contained only one sentence. We believe this may belong to the woman your husband has been seeing. My eyes remained fixed on the screen while every peaceful feeling from the morning quietly slipped away. The photograph remained on my phone long after the screen should have gone dark. A simple diamond ring resting inside a velvet box should not have had the power to unravel the calm I had finally begun to feel. Yet it did. My attorney's message explained that investigators believed my husband had purchased the ring months before telling me our marriage was over. The timeline hurt more than the discovery itself. It meant that while I had still been planning anniversary dinners and pretending our silence was temporary, he had already been planning another future. I slowly locked the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. The peaceful lake before me suddenly looked farther away than it had only moments earlier. Evelyn noticed the change in my expression immediately. She never asked to see the message. Instead, she quietly rested her camera against the dock railing and stood beside me without speaking. That simple kindness nearly broke my composure. "Bad news?" she asked gently after several silent minutes. I nodded. "Not new enough to change anything," I admitted. "Only new enough to make the past hurt in a different way." She looked across the water before answering. "Pain has a strange habit of arriving in layers. Sometimes we believe we have reached the bottom until another memory quietly appears." Her words settled over me with surprising comfort because they asked nothing of me except honesty. I told her about the photograph. I told her about the ring. I admitted that what hurt most was realizing how long I had been the only person still trying to save the marriage. Evelyn listened without interruption. When I finished, she quietly said, "Someone else's decision to stop loving honestly does not erase the love you gave honestly." I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing those words to settle somewhere deeper than the sadness. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking along a narrow trail that circled the lake. Fallen branches and scattered leaves reminded us how fierce the storm had been only hours earlier, yet sunlight continued finding its way through every opening in the trees. The landscape felt strangely symbolic, as though nature understood something I was only beginning to learn. Along the trail we discovered a weathered wooden lookout overlooking the valley below. Someone had carved a simple sentence into the railing years earlier. "Every road eventually becomes the right one if you keep walking." Evelyn smiled as she traced the faded letters with her fingertips. "I think people leave messages like this because they hope strangers will need them someday." I looked toward the endless forest stretching beyond the mountains. Today I am grateful someone did. As we started back toward the cabin, a county emergency truck slowly approached along the gravel road. The same park ranger climbed out and greeted us with an encouraging smile. "The main highway has reopened," he said. "Crews cleared the landslide earlier than expected. You should be able to leave safely within the next hour." His words should have brought relief. Instead, an unexpected heaviness settled quietly inside me. The cabin had never been my destination. It had been an accident created by terrible weather. Yet somewhere between shared meals, honest conversations, and quiet mornings beside the lake, it had become a place where I remembered who I was before disappointment reshaped my life. Evelyn thanked the ranger while I stood silently beside the porch, looking at my packed overnight bag through the open doorway. Leaving suddenly felt much harder than arriving had ever been. Later, as I carried my suitcase toward the car, Evelyn handed me the photograph she had taken beside the lake that morning. On the back she had written only 4 words in careful handwriting. "Keep choosing your sunrise." I smiled through unexpected tears, thanked her quietly, and placed the photograph inside my journal. Then I climbed into my car, believing our story had ended with the storm, never realizing that the hardest goodbye would become the beginning of the greatest misunderstanding either of us had yet to face. The drive away from the mountains should have felt like moving forward, yet every mile only deepened the quiet ache I carried home. The photograph Evelyn had given me rested inside the passenger seat, tucked carefully between the pages of my journal as though it had always belonged there. For several days I tried convincing myself that the weekend had simply been an unexpected pause in a difficult chapter of my life. My attorney finalized another round of paperwork. Friends called to check on me. Boxes slowly filled with belongings from the house I would soon leave behind. Life continued exactly as it was supposed to. Only my thoughts refused to cooperate. Every ordinary moment somehow reminded me of the woman who had made silence feel comforting instead of lonely. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I finally gathered enough courage to send Evelyn a simple message. Thank you again for everything. I hope your travels are going well. Hours passed without a reply. Evening became night. The following morning my phone remained silent. I told myself she was probably somewhere without cell service, photographing another remote forest or forgotten shoreline. Still, disappointment quietly settled inside me. 3 days later, an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. It belonged to the owner of the mountain cabin. I hope you do not mind me calling, the elderly woman said warmly. Evelyn asked me to reach out if I ever heard from you. My heart immediately lifted. Is she all right? A brief pause followed. She left the cabin the same afternoon you did because her sister was unexpectedly admitted to the hospital after a serious medical emergency. Evelyn has been staying with her family ever since. She lost her phone during the trip and could not recover most of her contacts. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I had to sit down. All the quiet fears I had built over the past several days dissolved almost instantly. She had not ignored me. Life had simply carried her somewhere unexpected. Before ending the call, the cabin owner hesitated. There is one more thing, she added gently. Evelyn left something here. She asked me to give it to you if you ever came back. The following Saturday I found myself driving toward the same lake beneath bright autumn skies instead of storm clouds. The mountains looked completely different without rain hiding their beauty. When I reached the cabin, the owner welcomed me with a warm embrace before placing a small leather notebook into my hands. She wrote this during the storm, the woman explained softly. She was too shy to leave it with you herself. I opened the notebook while sitting on the familiar porch overlooking the peaceful water. Most of the pages contained sketches, travel notes, and ideas for future photography projects. Near the end I found an entry dated the morning we left. I never expected one storm to introduce me to someone who reminded me that kindness still feels like home. I do not know whether our paths will ever cross again, but if they do, I hope she chooses me freely instead of because bad weather left us with no other option. My eyes filled with quiet tears before I finished the final sentence. Some people arrive exactly when your heart has forgotten how to hope. I closed the notebook gently against my chest. At that exact moment I heard footsteps crossing the wooden dock behind me. I turned slowly, almost afraid to trust what my heart already recognized before my eyes confirmed it. Evelyn stood at the end of the path wearing the same gentle smile that had greeted me on the night the storm changed everything. She looked surprised for only a heartbeat before softly laughing to herself. I came here hoping I might find a little closure, she admitted. I smiled through tears that no longer belonged to sadness. Maybe neither of us came here looking for closure. She walked the remaining distance between us until we stood face to face once again beneath clear autumn skies. This time there was no storm forcing us to stay. There was no single bed deciding our circumstances. There was only a choice. And when she quietly reached for my hand, I realized that the most meaningful journeys never begin because we are trapped together. They begin because, after everything we have survived, we freely decide to keep walking in the same direction. We stood on the old wooden dock for a long time without saying much, letting the quiet afternoon speak for us. The lake reflected the pale blue autumn sky while golden leaves drifted gently across the water. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. It felt honest. Evelyn never rushed toward me, and I realized that was one of the things I admired most about her. She always allowed people the space to arrive at their own feelings. I kept thinking about that weekend, I admitted softly. I thought it was only because of everything I was going through. She smiled with quiet understanding. I thought exactly the same thing. We laughed together, and the familiar warmth between us returned as naturally as breathing. The owner of the cabin invited us inside for fresh coffee before beginning the drive home. We accepted without hesitation. The little cabin looked exactly as it had during the storm, except sunlight now streamed through every window instead of lightning. The same wooden table stood beside the fireplace. The same shelves held the same weathered books. Even the oversized bed remained exactly where it had been, though now it seemed less like an awkward memory and more like the beginning of a story neither of us had expected to write. We spent the afternoon talking without interruption. Evelyn told me about the weeks she had spent helping her sister recover, sleeping in hospital waiting rooms, and wondering whether she had imagined the connection we had shared beside the lake. I told her about packing away 3 decades of memories, signing the final divorce papers, and discovering that healing often arrived one quiet decision at a time instead of all at once. Neither of us pretended those months had been easy. They had simply changed us in ways we could finally appreciate. Before leaving the cabin, Evelyn asked if I wanted to walk the trail around the lake one more time. We followed the familiar path beneath tall pine trees glowing with late afternoon sunlight. The air carried the scent of cedar and cool water, and every familiar place reminded us of conversations that had quietly reshaped our lives. When we reached the overlook where we had first watched the sunrise after the storm, Evelyn stopped and looked toward the distant mountains. "I have spent years believing freedom meant never staying anywhere too long," she said thoughtfully. "Now I think freedom might actually mean finding someone who makes staying feel like another kind of adventure." I looked at her for several silent seconds before answering. For years I believed love meant sacrificing pieces of myself until someone else felt complete. Now I know real love asks you to become more yourself instead. She turned toward me with gentle surprise, and I realized those words were as new to me as they were to her. We continued walking until the sun began slipping behind the mountains, painting the sky with soft shades of amber and rose. Near the end of the trail we found a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake. We sat together, shoulders almost touching, watching the last light shimmer across the water. This time there was no uncertainty between us. I reached for her hand because I wanted to, not because circumstances had placed us together. She intertwined her fingers with mine and smiled without looking away from the sunset. "Would you like to have dinner with me next weekend?" she asked quietly. Not because of a storm, not because of a cabin, just because I would like to know what comes after this. I smiled before she even finished the question. I would like that very much. As the first evening stars appeared above the lake, I realized the greatest change had not happened in my surroundings. It had happened inside my heart. The woman who had driven into the mountains believing her story was ending had quietly disappeared. In her place stood someone willing to believe that the most beautiful chapters are often the ones we never planned to write. 1 year later I found myself standing on the same wooden dock where everything had quietly begun, holding 2 mugs of coffee while the morning sun painted soft ribbons of gold across the lake. The cabin looked unchanged. The pine trees still surrounded the shoreline. The old rocking chair still rested on the porch. Even the weathered welcome sign hanging beside the front door had faded only a little. Yet everything important had changed because we had changed. Evelyn stepped outside carrying her camera over one shoulder, and smiled the moment she saw me. "You woke up before sunrise again," she teased gently. I handed her one of the mugs. "Some habits are worth keeping." She laughed, and I realized that sound had become one of my favorite parts of every morning. We had never rushed our story. After that first dinner together, we continued choosing each other one ordinary day at a time. We learned how to disagree without walking away. We learned how to protect each other's quiet moments instead of trying to fill every silence. We learned that trust is not built through dramatic promises, but through small acts repeated with consistency and care. My divorce had long since become another chapter instead of the entire book. Evelyn continued photographing forests, coastlines, and forgotten places across the Pacific Northwest, and whenever our schedules allowed, I joined her. Sometimes I sketched ideas for homes while she searched for the perfect light. Other times we simply sat beside a lake with sandwiches packed in a cooler, saying very little because neither of us needed constant conversation to feel connected. The greatest surprise was not that I had fallen in love again. The greatest surprise was discovering that love could feel peaceful instead of exhausting. Later that afternoon we walked the familiar trail around the lake once more. The carved message on the old overlook remained exactly where we remembered it. Every road eventually becomes the right one if you keep walking. Evelyn smiled as she brushed a few fallen leaves from the railing. I think whoever wrote this would be happy to know they were right. I reached for her hand without hesitation. I think they already knew. Before leaving, we returned to the cabin one final time. The owner greeted us warmly and laughed when she noticed us looking around the little bedroom. Still only one bed, she joked. Evelyn glanced at me with playful eyes. Funny how that used to feel like the biggest problem in the world. I smiled. It turned out to be the smallest. We all laughed together before stepping outside into the cool afternoon air. As we drove away from the mountains, I looked back one last time at the cabin growing smaller in the distance. I no longer saw the place where a storm had trapped two strangers. I saw the place where fear slowly made room for hope, where honesty replaced loneliness, and where I remembered that beginning again is not something reserved for younger people. It belongs to anyone brave enough to believe tomorrow can still surprise them. I used to think the most important journey of my life ended the day my marriage fell apart. I understand now that it was only the road that led me toward the life I was finally ready to live. Sometimes healing arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks like a warm cup of coffee, an unexpected conversation, or someone who listens without asking you to become anyone other than yourself. And sometimes the heart does not need perfect timing. It only needs one sincere chance to open again. If there is one truth I carry with me every single day, it is this. The storms we fear most often clear the path to the home we never knew was waiting for us. And the courage to love again always begins with the courage to believe that we are still worthy of being loved.